bring an institute's colloquium into being together with my colleague Christian Botius years ago when I started here, and we both had our position practically in the same year. And we thought, we don't even know what our colleagues are doing, so we should have a colloquium and talk about our work. And that's basically the meaning of it, not only to invite people from outside, that too, but primarily to get into a discussion and exchange amongst colleagues. And that's what we do today. Egor Novikov, many of you know him already, because he's teaching as an assistant professor at the Department of Anthropology in SAI. But he is also an ex-PhD student. He did his doctoral thesis, finalized it and submitted it, and he passed with summa cum laude, and his work is quite interesting, so I thought it might be of greater interest for all of you. And I say a couple of words about his CV. So he is born in Siberia and went somehow westwards to Petersburg, St. Petersburg, where he studied philosophy for quite some time, before he then shifted to anthropology and sociology, first in Budapest and then for a doctoral program here at Heidelberg University at the SAI. And in these two talents, basically philosophy and anthropology, they are only part of what he's doing, because what he's also doing, you can see here, he's an artist, he does sculptures, he does sketches, and worked in the kind of intersection of performance, filming, and writing also. The journalist worked for some time, and if you have a chance to read his doctoral thesis, you will see that, or you will read it basically, that he writes really well and compelling. So in between, what is the red thread? I think it's death, decay, and filth. That's what I can see. Yeah. And that is what he's talking about today, transgressive touches. That's his field work in a shelter for the dying in Kolkata. And that's basically also, I would say, the essence of what philosophy is, at least according to Plato, who would not say that philosophy is making theories. It's a total misunderstanding, but it's learning how to die. So, Egor, fasten your seatbelts, and Egor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, to all you for coming here, despite this quite abject weather. And I have talked about my research on various occasions here already, in shorter format, but it's a first opportunity for me to talk about it at more length a little bit, which I'm also very grateful and happy about. So, and as Professor von Bacher said, this talk will be based on my doctoral research, mostly a part of it. And it's, as it is clear from the title, it is what you can call a phenomenological anthropological research based a lot on the embodiment and the experiences of touch. And the location of the research is at in Kolkata in general, in the capital of West Bengal, and more specifically, most of the things I will be talking about, they take place in the place called Nirmal Hriday, the home for the dying and destitute of Mother Teresa, the most famous perhaps and the first of her shelters founded in Kolkata and later spread around the world with her network of her order. But so as the talk will be a lot about the embodied experiences, as I said, and their ethical interpretation, I want to start first from showing a snippet of the place where everything happens. So you have like already from the beginning a better context about of the entire research. Alright, so this video was, I took it at the research place at the Kolkata Home for the Dying and Destitute. And we also already that volunteer and work, one kind of the works which the volunteers are doing in this place, which was in this case delivering a deceased resident of the shelter to a cemetery, to a Muslim cemetery. So, and to get into it, what is the question which I posed about all this context, right? About the work of the volunteers is about the role of objection, or about the role of disgust, repulsion, the role of the unpleasant experiences in the ethics of humanitarian work, humanitarian ethics. So why is it important as a research question? Because that is obviously one of the areas which is addressed and underrepresented in the studies of humanitarian work, because it is typically assumed that is just a insignificant, meaningless addition to the work which the humanitarian workers have to overcome in order to do good. Because the typical ethical understanding of the framing of the humanitarian work is a work of helping, doing good. So it's a kind of, it's understood from outside usually with some mixture of utilitarian and normative deontological ethics, right? So it's about saving lives, and it's about reducing suffering or multiplying pleasure, as it's usually considered in the utilitarian logic. And basically this logic also is reproduced in the humanitarian organizations themselves, in particular in the administration. For instance, this quote from the talk, from the speech of the president of the Doctors Without Borders at the Nobel Prize acceptance ceremony, where he says that the humanitarianism aims to build spaces of normalcy in the midst of what is profoundly abnormal. Right. So this kind of function of normalization is considered to be the meaningful part of the work. But if one looks into the experiences of the humanitarian workers actually, into what they do in the field, it is clear that the experience of humanitarian work is essentially ambivalent, dirty. There is no clear moral also solutions to things they do. Neither the ethics of duty, just as to save life, for instance, even such a ultimate idea as the salvation of human life, oftentimes is not the thing which is obeyed kind of consistently and totally. Sometimes it is accepted that someone dies, and in the humanitarian field it is particularly clear that this is the reality. And the suffering as well is accepted as a part of the reality. And on the other hand, the utilitarian, of course, calculations, no one, if I did particularly also research on this topic, among the volunteers, none of them really consistently thinks of what they're doing in terms of producing the most pleasure or reducing the most suffering, or somehow else calculating the kind of neutral, objective, biggest positive effect of their work. It would be like too much to go deep into this ambivalent moral economies, what can be called, of the humanitarian work. For instance, Didier Fassin in his book Humanitarian Reason wrote very well about it, following the actual moral models underlying humanitarian work, a lot of which is, of course, the secularized religious models, starting from the idea of the sacred life, because it is the most obvious example where the idea that human life is sacred, which most of us take for granted as a given, as a axiom, is if you start thinking about it, it's absolutely not obvious why it is so, right? And he, of course, traces it back genealogically to the religious, to Christian, first of all, understanding of the human as a creature, like a model of God with an eternal soul, and so on and so forth. And further on, there are these models of, also the religious models of taking care of the population, the model of the good shepherd, what he calls, which is reproduced in humanitarian aid, and the meaning attached to suffering is also reproduced a lot on the religious, first of all, Christian models. So at the end, how do I want to understand the ethics in this context is, it is obvious that in this unclear context, one has to look at the people themselves. Basically, and approach the ethics from the logic of what is called the virtue ethics, ethics of virtue, which were in anthropology developed lately a lot by James Laidlaw, for instance, and it of course owes a lot to the philosophy of Michel Foucault, who basically revived it and evolved a new understanding of the ethics of virtue as the ethics of freedom and subjectivation, right? It is about, the ethics is all about how the person built themselves in the context, using what he calls the practices of self. And it's basically context dependent, first of all, and secondly, it is, right, it's about the person. It's not about the normative or utilitarian assumptions which navigate the actions from outside. All right, so coming to the matter, the object of research. The research is mostly about the volunteers, who are the amateur and semi-professional humanitarian workers. Which means that many of them are just gap year students or travelers, many of them are medical workers, nurses, who also use this time to work outside of their professional framework. Mostly they come from the global north or from economically wealthier countries, let's say. Lately there's also a lot of people from Asia, from China in particular, and especially Japan coming there. And they are of diverse religious and cultural backgrounds. Of course, in Kolkata, there is a lot of Catholics who come there because of Mother Teresa. And because the whole humanitarian world there, it's kind of evolved around Mother Teresa to an extent. Everyone knows it, at least, and that's a main symbolic figure. But they can come absolutely from different religious and cultural backgrounds. And many of them come there in the liminal phase of biography, because they want to change their life, they want to find themselves, they have lost their job, quit the job, or broke up, or and so on and so forth. So it's, for many of them, it is a kind of semi-conscious transformation ritual, rite of passage, when they want to find some other meaning of life or way of living. So this, on the left photo, you see them going to work, bypassing one of the big garbage dumps on the way to the Mother Teresa's central fund. And the other one is a Spanish volunteer whom we'll mention later, Maria Jose. She's 18 years old back then. And she was working in the medical department, quite tough job in the shelter for the dying. And this is another photo of the volunteers going to work to the Gallagher shelter, and on the in front of them here on the foreground you see the novices of the Order of the Missionaries of Charity. Missionaries of Charity is the order founded by Mother Teresa, and still running most of her institutions. Most of you know them. They have this distinguishable white saris with the blue stripes on the forehead. But they're novices. They just wear white saris without any stripes. They are like the sisters to become, right? Who are not haven't taken the vows yet. So, what does the volunteer experience consist of? There's a quote from Romain, a Japanese-French volunteer, who told me, "I felt like my soul was dying in the office, and to revive it I had to feel some real life and touch it." So this is kind of like conscious also desire for many of the volunteers, that they want to break their routine and touch something else. And this internal motive of volunteering has been analyzed quite a lot in the anthropology of humanitarianism. Of course, there's a lot of work which criticizes volunteering and voluntourism, what is called, like this mixture of volunteering and tourism. as a political, economical, and social institution, right? But there is also a big amount of literature which works with the humanitarian work and volunteering as an experience which has a value as such in itself, outside of the external aim and external ethics, which are always ambivalent for the humanitarian work, the amount of good or bad which it produces, right? And so for them there is Erika Bornstein wrote about it really well, about the volunteering in Delhi, how the formal and informal and at the same time the religious and secular mixes and collides in the volunteering experience, and how kind of people mix them to make sense of what they're doing, and create connections across these very asymmetrical relations of giving, right, which is a constant problem of volunteering. And Lisa Malki, Finnish anthropologist, she wrote particularly well about this experience of rupture, which the volunteers desire and obtain. If you can see here in the quote, she writes about self-escape, self-loss, dehumanization, self-humanization, self-transformation, the care of the self, and so on. All these things which are not usually associated with the humanitarian work, seen as a aim-oriented activity. So where all takes place in Kolkata, as I said, and of course in Kolkata there is a lot of cultural background which the volunteers are aware of, and which creates for them a particular background for the experience. All this mystical, exoticized to an extent cultural background, and also experientially this confusing mix of the public and private, when they see people living right on the street or doing very private things right on the street, and they encounter for instance animal corpses or even badly sick people right on the street, and at the same time something which they admire as very aesthetic, beautiful smells, beautiful visions, and so on. So all this kind of confusing, very intense mixture of everything already for them is a decentering sort of experience, which disrupts what the usual patterns of perception. And the work they mostly, of course, the Kolkata, the volunteers is not the Kolkata as such, right? It should be said from the beginning that it is the Kolkata of slums, train station, hospitals, hospices, shelters of Mother Teresa, which is most of the locals whom I knew in Kolkata, they have never been or rarely been in such places where the volunteers spend most of their time, right? Which doesn't mean that it's a Kolkata which is less real, but it also doesn't mean that it is the Kolkata as is. It is a very particular sort of Kolkata. So, the shelter, Nirmal Hridai, the home for the dying and destitute, it is the first shelter, as I said, founded by Mother Teresa in a former Dharamsala. So actually it stands right next to one of the most well-known and biggest temples of Kali, the Kalikat temple. It's a place where there's constantly a torrent of worshippers, animal sacrifices performed there regularly, like a very venerated place, and very loud as well. And she was allowed at some point to start bringing dying people from the streets to this Dharamsala, and gradually she occupied entirely the building. And then we can maybe come back later if you want. There were also, of course, talks about that she should leave it and give it back to the temple, but it was never really pursued, and so far it's not a question whether it will happen or not. But it's a very provocative and interesting juxtaposition, right, of very different saintly figures from very powerful, both of them symbolically, but from absolutely different contexts. And it's run, as I said, by her sisters, the Missionaries of Charity. And there is always about a dozen or two volunteers working there, and also a significant number of hired workers, the local workers who just earn their living by doing this, what they see as dirty jobs. And this is the image from the roof of of the shelter in the Kolkata home. It's Archangel Michael trampling the devil in the form of a snake or a dragon and overlooking the dome of the Kolkata. So whom do the volunteers serve there? It is the destitute people picked from the streets, as I said, in severe physical condition usually. Things which, as many volunteers say, you don't see in the regular life at all in the West. It's like very bad rotten wounds, parasites, and so on. Most of them in the shelter do not stay for a long time. There are many shelters of Mother Teresa across the city. Some of them like permanent ones for people to reside there until they die for many years. But in this one, people stay usually only for a few weeks, and then they either transfer to another shelter where they stay, or they are, if they seem to be capable of maintaining themselves on the street, they're released back to the streets, or go back to their home if they come from some village or suburbs, or they die. Nowadays, a minority of them dies. Earlier it was much more. But still quite some of them regularly die. There is every week, like every day, 1 or 2 persons that we usually. They are collected from the streets, as I said, sometimes calls, tells them they see people who's dying there, some volunteer passes and see a person in a very bad condition and calls up the sisters. Also, there are regularly squads of scouts going around the train stations, the Howrah and Seattle, especially the 2 biggest train stations, where they collect the people because, first of all, people themselves tend to dwell a lot around the train station, like the destitute, the homeless people. And secondly, a lot of people send their relatives to the train stations from the villages around, or the suburbs, when they see that they're in very bad condition and they cannot take care of them because they know that the people will be carried out from the train at the terminal station, and then the sisters will come and find the person and bring them to the shop. So the place itself inside. That's how photographer Michael Kelpie describes it, right? His first impression as he comes there, that I thought that I would be prepared for anything I might see, but it is the shocking smell of death, disease, excrement, and decay, however, that hits me first and hardest as I walk in. Looking around, I see people experiencing real suffering. Some have gaping wounds with bone exposed. There is the sound of constant coughing and spitting. I keep my lips sealed as tightly as possible. Those who have died are wrapped in shrouds and taken out. Even though I'm a professional photographer by trade, I find it hard to take pictures here. So, obviously, it's even for those who are spending time in Kolkata, which is already kind of an intense place for the Westerners, this place is experienced as something otherworldly and challenging. But nevertheless, from the first day, gradually, but quite fast, the volunteers start doing the work there, which is mostly cleaning the residents, washing their bed sheets and their pajamas, carrying them around to the bathrooms, especially all the time, feeding them, shaving them, and doing kind of simple jobs which they can do. Some of them mostly who have some at least basic medical competence, also work, assist in the dressing rooms with the wounds. And they accompany the dying, and they deliver the bodies of the residents, as you saw in the beginning in the video which I showed. Either if it is a Hindu person who died, they deliver to a crematorium nearby, or if it's a Muslim or Christian, they deliver to their own communities, respectively, for burial. This is a volunteer returning from the video already with an empty stretcher behind him. So, the theory, how I approach to understand this experience, which is obviously challenging and disrupting. But what exactly happens there? There has been already a theoretical approach developed to understand it in the nursing studies, understandably, where it is a persistent question, persistent problem, right? There was a 1959 influential article by Isabel Menzies-Leith, where she wrote for the first time explicitly in the psychoanalytic key about these primitive anxieties, which are raised by such work in the nurses, writing that it is a common reason for the nurses to quit their job, nurses in training in particular. And she already then identified that the institutions, the medical institutions, tend to structure the work in a way to protect the nurses from these experiences, to establish the repeated routines, a division of labor, identification of patients by numbers rather than by the name, to detach them, to detach the nurses from them. And in general, the idealization of the detached nurse as a character, right, as an ideal to follow. And then recently there has been written more about it in the same psychoanalytic key, in particular Rosemary Risk and David Holmes started writing about how to deal with this problem of institutionalized objectification, sort of protective objectification of the patients, using the psychoanalytic framework. And this psychoanalytic framework is basically the term of objection and the whole theory surrounding it, developed by Jacques Lacan and especially after him by Julia Kristeva. So, what is it about? Basically, the objection, which is not the most common English word, and especially the noun, the adjective, right? It comes from the translation of the French words which Kristeva uses, and it is a word of Latin origin, obviously from abicere, which means to cast away, to throw away. And she develops her understanding of this psychological mechanism basically on the very well-known structural understanding of dirt of Mary Douglas, who wrote that dirt is a cognitive phenomenon, right? It is not a physical phenomenon, it is something which does not fit into our cognitive structures, so we protect ourselves and the society especially from it by casting it away or framing it in some way that it does not invade into the order. But Julia Kristeva so brings it back onto the basic psychological mechanism, and she argues that basically objection is the core mechanism of subjectivity, that the self is born from repulsion. That, to put it very simply, she writes about this process of developing a sense of self, that one is born without a sense of self, obviously, and the baby does not realize itself as a separate subject. It perceives itself as a part of maternal unity, what is called, like one with the mother and one with the whole world. And she says that this is exactly the moment when the sense of self develops in the human, is the moment of repulsion, when they for the first time feel this nausea, desire to vomit, because this is exactly the reaction of separating yourself from the maternal unity. And through the life, it remains the mechanism through which self maintains itself by pushing away, rejecting everything which they feel puts in danger our sense of integrity, our sense of separation from the world, and our cognitive structures, right? So it is, first of all, the slimy things, all the decaying things, it is all the feces, all the things which are questioning the individual self, let's say, in various ways. But also, she extends it all the way to the symbolic ambiguities of all sorts, like the betrayal or confusion, monstrosity, of course, and so on and so forth. So, in the context of the nursing studies, right, the Risk and Holmes and others, they write about this mechanism of objection becomes institutionalized in the institutions because they make it a rule to protect their own power, their own integrity, and also to protect the sense of self, kind of the integrity of their workers from the mental stress. They institutionalized all this objectification of the patients, especially the patients who are seen as particularly abject. Holmes writes a lot about, for instance, homosexual patients, AIDS patients, and but also it expands to all sorts of homeless or wounded patients with rotten wounds and so on. Those are particularly challenging, and those are particularly kind of abject in the institutional context. What do we see in the case of volunteer in Kolkata? So the thing is that Kolkata doesn't function as a medical institution explicitly. And it's criticized for that a lot. A lot of people who come say that the Mother Teresa is bad and her sisters are bad because they are irrational, because they are not progressive enough, because they refuse to structure their work following the medical logic. Which is true to an extent. To an extent, they kind of find a compromise. They use a lot of, they have hired doctor always there. By the way, Didier Fasson himself used to be the supervising doctor of the shelter many years back, as I found out. But they are not medical, and they refuse to frame themselves as medical. They refuse to refer to their residents as patients. They also do not save, again, life by all costs. They accept that if someone dies, that is kind of natural in their logic, in the religious logic in particular. And here's a quote by Mother Teresa, somewhere on the board, on a board in one of the homes which I photographed. The biggest disease today is not leprosy or tuberculosis, but rather the feeling of being unwanted. Right, so this is an example of the non-medical approach to what they're doing. So, and regarding the total institution, I will not go far into it, but this is the Goffman's concept, which many people know, probably the total institution, which is the case with many mental institutions and medical institutions in particular. And one of the features of them that they really structure the life of the people contained there, and they really separate them strongly from the people who are taking care of them or who are in their life. Right? And this is also not a fully total institution, although the residents are wearing uniform pajamas and all. There is a strong element of non-structured connection with them, which I'll talk about now. So, the volunteers are invited and even stimulated to engage into very non-formal work with the residents. First of all, because there's no one comes to volunteer there, no one tells you what you want to do. If you're completely lost, they will offer you, like, yeah, go to wash some bed sheets now with the others, or go shave someone. But it's usually self-organized work where everyone finds the jobs which they are ready to do, and everything is done. For instance, one example I use is the lack of gloves in the shelter, right? Which is a very typical attribute of all the medical work, is the silicone gloves through which the medical workers separate themselves from the patients. It's a non-permeable film which doesn't allow exchange of fluids between your bodies. Also for, of course, for the medical and cross-contamination reasons, but also it is, of course, a big psychological instrument. Because when you're operating something with the gloves, you're operating it as an object, not as another person. And it protects the psyche, right, of the challenge of being really close, touching the object. But here, there was no gloves. Some people used it sometimes, they were available, but they were not common, and especially they were made obsolete in the very beginning of the working day if someone would put gloves on, because most of the volunteers started their work with doing laundry. Like these big basins where the dirty bed sheets and pajamas are floating, and everyone just comes and starts rubbing them. They're like with feces, blood, and pus and all, everything is on them. And of course, if you're wearing the gloves will just get full of water and they will become useless. So it was like an introductory ritual to start touching the dirty things and getting accommodated to it. And everyone in the process found a comfortable distance to it. There was no, some people easier worked with the dirty matters or cleaned the wounds. Some people did it harder, some like completely restrained themselves, so would just hang the bed sheets on the roof, staying away. But usually it was like a trajectory of people getting more and more into accommodating themselves to doing the unpleasant things. And like a couple of words about phenomenological understanding of it. So these experiences of dirt from the point of phenomenology, as Bernard Waldenfels wrote, for instance, this is what he calls the hyperphenomenon. The dirt is a phenomenon which you cannot accommodate as a meaningful thing into your worldview. As one could see there in the shelter, it is always a challenging object, which is always one has to force oneself, or as soon as it falls into attention, as soon as one cannot turn away from it, one has to pass through the objection, let's say, right? It never becomes familiar. It's always challenging, but this challenge exactly is what, for many volunteers, apparently makes their experience more valid, as I will show later. And in more broad phenomenological terms, Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote that sensation is literally a form of communion, meaning that the sensation of being there is basically sensing means letting them into yourself already in a way, as yourself as a part of the environment in which you are. Basically, that the people do not perceive the place where they are as a subject looking at the object; they perceive themselves as a part of it through their senses. And with all the senses of noise and smell and touch and everything in the Gallica, basically, to a large extent, it was an experience of communion with radical otherness, which cannot be accommodated as a part of self. So, as I said, they did it gradually. The volunteers learn to go through the repulsion, and they used various practices of self, what can be called, or technologies of self, even better in the terms of Michel Foucault. So basically, different interpretive models or different behavioral patterns which allow them to pass the hardest point of repulsion and to start doing something. Right? Sometimes at the beginning, just can be simply kind of putting yourself together and not reacting to anything and just trying to do the thing which you have to do, like massaging some sick body, which felt really hard for some of them in the beginning. Another example of this is the body of Christ model. Body of Christ model is the one was offered in the Christian religious context of the Missionaries of Charity. It is a writing which you would see a lot on the walls there in different materials about Mother Teresa. This is a drawing, for instance, from the male bathroom in the Gallica, where it's written right opposite the entrance on the wall. And the body of Christ model, of course, means what? It means that this sick, abject body in front of you, which you are afraid to touch, is the body of Christ himself. And this worked for many people, for many volunteers, as you could see, because it's kind of this non-dual motif through which they could accustom themselves to this radical otherness as something, basically to overcome their protective mechanism of the self through objection, to touch and to feel in the same space with the radically other body. I won't go much into the examples, but yeah, there's a few examples from different people how they exactly managed to overcome these main challenges. which are here, for instance, the examples of one is, as I said, massaging the skin of someone, of a sick person, which is a quite common job there. And the other one is the smell of pee. One volunteer, Cynthia, had to deal with as she worked in one of the shelters, changing the diapers all the time. And the stepping on the slimy food remnants, for instance, on the floor, mixed with saliva and all, which she, with satisfaction, says that she overcame it and she was very much more relaxed walking barefoot around after she got accustomed to that. And this is another example of one volunteer who also writes in a very literary manner in a book, basically in a collection of volunteers' experience about how she could not pick a very fragile, sort of dying woman in the Gallagher shelter. When one of the sisters told her to do it, to wash her, and then suddenly, and she said, I was still absolutely catatonic, then all of a sudden the whole room just lit up. 1 minute I was saying I can't, and the next I realized, of course I could. It was the body of Christ. Anybody, whoever they are, can be Christ. That was that old little lady who was covered in scabies. It was the whole world that was the body of Christ. So, what is the attraction of this experience for the volunteers themselves? The interesting thing about the objection, as I talked before, is that the transgression of the objection is not only scary, but it's also attractive. The objection itself at the same time excites and scares. Christopher writes about it a lot, that basically seeing a smashed rat on the street, it forces us to turn away, but at the same time it attracts us, it drags our attention to it, because we experience it as if standing in front of an abyss. The abyss of the maternal unity, what she calls, right? So basically, when one encounters the object in front of them, you feel that you are at the borders of your subjectivity, of your control subjectivity, of your cognitive order. And that living this order, losing your sense of self, losing your individuality is the biggest fear of the person, but at the same time it is the biggest desire, because it is the return to the comfortable state of maternal unity, which was before we became the subjects. It is basically getting rid of all the necessity to maintain oneself constantly as a subject. And so basically, this is what Georges Bataille, as well in his writings, describes as the inner experience. It is the experience of losing yourself in the sacred, in the non-structured, of getting rid of your limited human duality. And basically, so the filth represents to us this lack of structure, and is connected in this way structurally to the sacred very closely. And for instance, he writes about the rotting corpse, Georges Bataille, that the rotting corpse is so scary for us, right? Not because it is lifeless, but for the opposite reason, because it's too full of life. It is the life breathing uncontrollably. It is the representation of the universe itself, which is for us mysterious and scary and attractive at the same time. And if some of you know the poem of Baudelaire, A Carcass, there's one where this understanding of the object is aestheticized and described in a very vivid manner. The attractivity of the disordered. So basically, it represents freedom and transformation and transgression and going out from the utilitarian limited world into the sacred. And in this way, this whole volunteering experience can be connected to many mystical practices. So basically, in Christianity, there is a lot of examples of that. Very well known with kisses the lepers. Kissing the lepers, like St. Francis kissed the lepers in his highest point of his Saint Catherine of Siena. In this image here in the middle, you can see she like also ate pus from a wound of the woman she was serving because she was feeling like a very strong repulsion. She felt like she couldn't do this job anymore, cleaning her rotten wound. And then to overcome it, she forced herself to actually drink the pus. And this was also the highest point of her saintly biography. After that, she could not eat anymore. She only ate Holy Communions daily, and basically some say she died of holy anorexia because of that, because her body was too pure to take any food. And the other example, of course, not only in the Christian, but also in other mystical contexts like the Shaiva and Shakti, the Tantric, basically Hindu context, the Agori, for instance, ascetics, and other left-hand Shaiva ascetics. Also, it's a very obvious example of people using the filth and transgression to reach the unity with the sacred and to overcome the duality of their selves, right? Because for those who don't know, the Agori, for instance, and like many other these left-hand traditions, they can eat corpses from the street, or also corpses from the burning grounds, or drink whatever, all the impure things, and smoke and consume, and live also on the cremation grounds and so on and so forth. So, coming to the end, what it's all about? It tells us about the volunteering itself. It's not necessarily a strong mystical experience for all of them, although for some it is. But what is this result of the transgression of their objection brings to many of the volunteers, as they say, as for instance Marie here says, is a better sense of managing their lives and the sense of being in the world, that she learns to worry less, basically, to embrace anxiety in an extent, to learn to live with anxiety, to look into the eyes, and to not to bring themselves on the safe side of everything, right? And on the other hand, it creates a very particular ethical environment in the shelters and in other areas of the humanitarian encounters, I would say, because the very interesting element which a few volunteers mentioned, and also, for instance, Lisa Malki, whom I mentioned before, she wrote it in her book, that it creates a sense of nudity for the volunteers, that being next to these people in the shelter, we had no choice but to reveal ourselves, she said. It was impossible to hide behind artifice. I can't pretend or make up a character. It sounds false. The sound of life seems much louder than usual. So the simplicity of this contact in truth, she calls it. All right. So in conclusion, bringing to them some final points. As I said before, the volunteers are seeking transformation and liminality, and this is the mechanism which allows them to find what they're seeking there, at least many of them. These encounters and interactions with the object destabilize the cognitive structures and allow them to change themselves, to change their perspective, to transform themselves, to obtain new visions of something. Many of them, for instance, turn to religion, also to various forms of religiosity or spirituality. Just change their career paths and so on. So the transgression of the objection creates this sense of emotional nudity, which is a very particular ethical context, I would say. It creates particular ethical connections between the volunteers and the people with whom they are working. Very asymmetrical, of course, but also very non-structured and non-functional, and for this reason, kind of open-ended. Just qualitatively very different to what they're used to. The experience is a very real touch, a touch to the real in the Lacanian sense, something very authentic which they even struggle to formulate, but something definitely valuable experientially. And as I mentioned, the anxiety management capacity, basically, better understanding of self, and better skill of managing own emotions. And one other conclusion, that the non-secular religion-based organization oftentimes can offer better discursive instruments to deal with this experience of transgression and to overcome the institutionalized objection of the medical institutions. Because, yeah, this is, for instance, what the Holmes and Johansson wrote, right, about this problem of institutionalized objection in medical institutions, that if we recognize that the experience of objection produces both repulsion and fascination, as I said, that there is an attraction and excitement about it, this excitement of freedom and basically opening up their self and opening up the social structures, nurses may learn to mobilize this sense of fascination to improve their practices. To do so is to accept that the boundaries of our own subjectivity may temporarily weaken. And this is something very scary, but also something very rewarding, as many volunteers say. That we enter into a space of mutual transformation for both nurse and the patient. Basically, this is about this quite particular ethical environment. And finally, the final point that I would say, that I would suggest that the humanitarianism in general dwells on this interaction with the abject side of reality, abject side of life, to a much larger extent than it is recognized often officially, both on the experiential level, which I was talking about now for the workers, but also on the institutional level of creating the symbolic, mining symbolic and political influence for the humanitarian action as such, just like the holy mystics of this example did for themselves as well. I'll finish it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these insights. I should have said, as you realize, Egor Novikov not only did research among the volunteers, he himself did volunteering. It was really participation, and so he speaks very much from an inside perspective. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing these insights, and I would like to open the floor for discussion. Please, are there questions or comments?
Yeah. Igor, thank you so much. I'm coming actually closer because I'm reading actually a very long conversation. I'm very moved. First of all, thank you so much. It was so rich and that was fascinating. I mean, that I could actually make a bridge like you with the concept that you have used in your dissertation. But I also was expecting to talk about the notion of care, as you mentioned in your poster, the ethics of care, which I tried actually to find it somehow in your dissertation, but this is still to me is very elusive. Or I don't know that that wasn't so clear in your dissertation to me. And I'm not sure that in which language you conducted your fieldwork, can I ask you? Because, for instance, when I'm thinking in Persian language, we have word for care, which is muraqabat, and comes from the root raqaba, and it means closeness, which implies actually the proximity as a dimension of care. And interestingly, we have another vocab in Farsi and also in Arabic, which is muraqabat, from the same root, which means asceticism and ascetic practice. And this is I mean that this is the background of my question somehow, because in this context, muraqaba is ascetic practices that involves mindfulness and self-discipline and all these kind of practices that we know already from asceticism. And the first question is that do the caregiver and the care receiver have the same vocab of this, what is going on there, that can we name it somehow? Is it something that we can name it, for instance, as a care, or what is going on there? How we can address it? And you mentioned actually very beautifully that there is not a same actually perception of what is going on. This is transgressive for some of them, and for volunteers or something different. And I have behind of this question, I have a Nietzschean idea. And because that it's, I don't know that, because that this is, Nietzsche talks about this asceticism, and I would like to know that how, for instance, to what extent actually this voluntarian practices or care practices is something different from asceticism, because this is something expressed very, expressed very explicitly in many, or I would say that in all actually monotheistic religions, especially in Christianity, and it's very close to your context. And as Nietzsche said that, and it's so sad somehow, that the ascetic practices glorifying somehow suffering, pain, repulsion, and this is for him actually a sign of nihilism in this part, because there is an afterlife, and they are all doing this kind of practices because this is not an actual life. We have another life in another world, and we are all doing these practices because the real worthy life is somewhere else. And that's why that, and therefore that this is also very connected to what you have described as a detached self, or what Bataille, for instance, as you mentioned, said, that losing yourself in the sacred, that Nietzsche we can understand, totally asceticism, that you are just detaching yourself from life, from work, from everybody, just to purifying yourself, and in the glorifying act of suffering, just find subject or find a relationship with itself. And sorry for this long question and comment, but that was my question, and I'm so happy that it
Thank you. Well, those are great questions. Essential, all of them, I would say. About the language, I did mostly in English and in Spanish. As I was talking with mostly Spanish-speaking or English-speaking volunteers. A lot of them come from Spain or from Latin America, because those are very Catholic countries. Those who come particularly for the Mother Teresa's centers. So, but for the care, it's a very interesting question. I didn't go into it much here, because the problem with care here, I would say, is that it is, exactly as you say, it is not a clear thing what it is. Especially, for instance, you can look at different languages or different cultures, what it consists of. So, for instance, like I wrote this also autoethnographic part in one of my chapters, where I wrote about how I had to help hold a person who was like undergoing a surgery on his rotten foot at that moment, and I had to kind of hold him from behind, also hold him from moving around too much, but also kind of to console him, and it was right here. I hugged Talu, Tal was his name, tied from behind, rubbing his shoulder between the pain-induced spasms as the doctor was cutting off his part of his toe. I look at the multiple scars of Tal's strained wrists and on his shaved bony skull, shaking right in front of my eyes. The intimate touch of the warm and rigid body squeezed to my chest, the suffocating stench of the rotten flesh, the reflection of the man's pain in my imagination, the necessity to apply physical coercion while playing the unfamiliar role of a treatment enforcing orderly, the juxtaposition of intimacy and strangeness, of disgust and sympathy, of pity and violence rendered me uncomfortably awake. It felt intense, absurd, and essential. And that's one example of where to see the care here, right? For other volunteers as well, there's a lot of job which they do which can be understood as care, massaging, cleaning, something. But it's also very, of course, asymmetrical. It's very much absolutely incompatible roles in which they are there, and it is always mixed kind of. It can be. I would say that in this aesthetic terms, for instance, in the terms of ethical terms, of the ethical connection, I would say, it, as you were suggesting, with one of the Iranian terms, the Persian terms, it is the co-presence, coexistence. I think that is a big part of what they're doing there. It is about being there and sharing the space and not turning away and forcing yourself not to turn away and to give something which you can give and share with them, and being also honest, being naked, as she wrote there, and so on. And I would say that goes towards that, and that is also, of course, goes towards the aestheticism question which you asked, because that is the care for the sisters as well. I would say, if you think about what is care for them, of course there is a very practical side of it. Give food to someone, clean someone's wounds, give medicine to someone. But as I said, it's not a aim-oriented action for them. They say we're not social workers. They say we're not fixing the world. They are very much aware of that. We are just there doing something for someone, because it's a part of their cosmology, because everything is meaningful according to the God's kind of order in the cosmos, and we just gotta be there to do our meaningful job here, not to change it. And with the asceticism, that's also a very good question. How much, like Mother Teresa, for instance, she wrote a lot of letters which were published later in a book recently, and she didn't want them to be published because it was the letters where she wrote about struggling with her lack of faith, that she was writing to her confessors, to her superiors, that she feels that the God is not talking to her anymore since many years, and that she is lost, and that she doesn't know what she's doing and why she's doing it, and so on. But her confessor decided to publish this book instead, to show what the sanctity consists of, in fact. And in this sense, of course, the asceticism is about touching the sacred and kind of overcoming yourself. But it's also, I probably would say that it would be too simple to think that it's kind of this simple salvation game, right? That you do it and I'm saved. It's always a game just about it's a practice of self. It's technology of self, of building who you are in this world through these references to the things which are beyond your comprehension and beyond the rational world.
The questions, Guido Steiner.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting and engaging, and the drawings are wonderful, by the way. I have one central question and then two that accompany them, and you can choose if the first one is really the interesting one. And that is a fairly complex one. The people who are living or dying in this shelter, in this home, are they in some way identified by name, and are there attempts to find more about their identity, to find their relatives? And also, how does that influence, or how does that get into the horizon of recognition, as it were, of the volunteers, who these people are? Because I was thinking, especially when you were giving this long quote about this lady who was very repulsed by the by this idea of washing this old decrepit lady. So that old lady changed from a bundle of bones to the body of Christ. Now, in a way, dignity is somewhere in between that, right? So I'm Guido, you're Egor, and you wouldn't feel very dignified to be either a bundle of bones or the body of Christ, I guess. So this kind of complexity of person is somewhat lost in that relationship, at least in the way that you portrayed it. And I wondered what is happening there. And the two other questions are related to each other. First of all, you didn't mention Turner. That was a bit of a surprise. And that is also related to the other question that did you keep in touch with some of the volunteers, and did their stay at Caveat Home actually make a difference for their lives? So did they really go through a liminal rite passage?
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point about, of course, the relations to the people themselves. Although I would leave it open how much being associated with the body of Christ is a dignifying or not. Because I think in many religious churches, especially also in the Muslim context, for instance, this is approached as one of the ways to overcome the inevitable asymmetry of the relations of the giving. Because of course the asymmetry is never abolished, but if someone does not anymore establish any personal relation with the person to whom they are giving, but they establish a relation with God in the giving, then it's maybe somehow this paradox of non-reciprocal giving, not paradox, the problem of non-reciprocal giving can be addressed. But as a side note, so yes, the thing is that the volunteers are very different. The identities of the people are known to the sisters, and the sisters try to contact their relatives, and also everyone who arrives at the shelter, they sign a paper, or those who rob them, if they cannot sign the paper, then they refuse the right to claim the body. That this person has nobody to take care of them as the necessary demand for to be admitted to the shelter, that there is no one who can care other than the sisters for the person. But then if the person recovers, they try to help them oftentimes to go back to where they are, to find out, or if they lost memory, to find out who they were, to connect them with their relatives and so on. And they really work on the individual basis. It's not, there's a kind of not bureaucratic approach of them, I would say. But also, oftentimes they cannot find names, and many people are there without names. For instance, there was one interesting story when they sketched a person who was there, and he wanted to write his name, as many of them do, on the portrait, and the sisters only this way learned what was his name, because he was not interested in telling his name to anyone before that. And the volunteers as well. The thing is that the volunteers oftentimes establish very close connections with particular residents. They have their kind of favorites, usually heavily impaired people, and then they learn quite a lot about the biography as well, and they learn about what they went through, and a lot of them tell about how they were shocked and impressed to understand what a safe, easy life they're living themselves back in their countries now. But of course, it depends. For those who come for a very short term, oftentimes they don't know even what the names of whom. As you spend time, you learn the name of this one gradually start to build personality right around them. And in some of them, it really develops into quite close connections. There also arises the problem of the volunteers still living at some point, because even if they stay for half a year, at the end they leave, and this person with whom you're bound closely is left alone, and then this person has to look for someone else with whom they will bind and will take care of them, especially if they're in a very severe condition. So yeah, but I would say this thing of the overcoming the objection and establishing this very non-social connection helps a lot with also seeing the identities in a way of the people. Also, as much as they can understand the cultural context, of course, but it's a different question. The Turner, of course, the liminality thing, it's presumed story, and I just didn't mention it to save time, and because I think most of people are aware that we're talking about the rites of passage when we talk about the liminality. And yes, the volunteers, many of them talk a lot about the change it made in them. Also, I didn't have time to quote too much. But also, there's also for some of them, it becomes a regular practice that they want to come every year or every few years to work there again. For them, it's like a regular, also psychotherapy, I guess, in a way. But for many, it remains, for most who stays there for a long time, more or less like a month at least, or so, it remains as a thing which they recall all the time. I spoke to them of the voice as a very important experience in their life, and it's something different. And many of them, as I said, like Yolden, who was actually studying here, by the way, he was a boss student. He told me that after that experience, he came there quite critical of Mother Teresa and the whole thing, of course, as many people who read the books about her. and he was atheist back then, but now he's Buddhist. He said he's from Hong Kong himself, and he said that this experience played a big role in him turning to Buddhism.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this talk. I learned a lot and I was really intrigued by your findings. I have two questions and it's mostly curiosity. So one is the relationship between the volunteers and the paid staff, because you said there's also local paid staff. I mean, is there a common language in their daily work? Is the paid staff doing the same kind of work, or is there really different working spheres? And can people who undergo such a transformation understand why maybe people do this out of completely different reasons? Where kind of humanitarian ethics doesn't play so much a role, but maybe just having a job. And the other thing is, just to be a bit the devil's advocate, I really wonder, why do the volunteers choose to go to India to do this kind of work? Because, you spoke about humanitarian ethics, you spoke about the asymmetrical relationships, so I think this kind of work they could do in their respective communities and countries with this, like taking care for homeless people or whatever. I think you can have the same kind of experience. So is there a reflection why it's necessary to go to India to do this work?
Thank you. Yeah, both quite key questions. With the local paid stuff, it's a very interesting distinction because of course it's very different, and they have quite often conflict between each other, the volunteers with the local paid stuff, because from the perspective of local workers, oftentimes the volunteers are incompetent and useless, especially they're not. Like, there are of course very kind of key volunteers who spend there a lot of time and they become also very important kind of workers, but many of them just come for a short time and they're really more of a liability from the point of practical work. And the volunteers often see the local workers as rude and too kind of practical, that they don't really have a proper ethical attitude. But of course there is one big distinction is with that it's a really dirty job. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, is that the dirty job can be dignifying and can be used as a symbolic capital, apparently, if it is done voluntarily, out of the position of cleanness, right? In the particular, there should be a particular cultural frame. For instance, they say about Mother Teresa, she always went to Kolkata, even when after she had many other shelters, to clean the toilets there. That was her kind of favorite job. And that is her part of her saintly kind of identity, right? But for the locals, mostly doing dirty job, it is something which brings you down also in the social hierarchy. And it's also one of my colleagues who is from Kolkata herself. Actually, she told me that she talked with some of these people working there, with the missionaries of charity, and they complained to her how much for them it is a stressful work, that for Hindu people, especially not of the high caste, it is something like you pollute yourself, right? You are putting your lower in the social relations. So yes, there is a big difference and a lot of misunderstanding about how each of them sees what the other ones are doing. And also there is, just to mention at the end, there is also a very interesting category of the workers who are in between, who are the former residents actually. Quite a few of the workers are the former residents, whom the sisters wanted to employ, and those actually much in better terms with the volunteers usually, and they also do with their work much less in the utilitarian manner and with more of this kind of co-presence sense, which is an interesting phenomenon. And why to India? Yeah, it's also an interesting question. It's something to research maybe more, but of course one of the obvious answers is that it is still a model of adventure, right? Which was what Zimmer described as an adventure, that you can go away from your regular setting, and then first of all, it's safer for you to transgress the regular rules. You're not afraid that much you will mess up your life by getting associated with some dirty people or something. And also doing things which you're not allowed usually to do back in the world, because the thing about Kolkata that it's very unregulated. It's a lot of humanitarian charity possibilities which are outside of the legal zone quite a lot. You can do all the things which you would not be able to do otherwise. And also all the setting of adventure as a mindset, right? It's like a pilgrimage that you go somewhere in that absolutely different, mysterious world where you learn yourself anew.
Yeah, well, listening to it was nice to hear the dissertation sort of consolidated into less than an hour to get another perspective on it. And when I was reading it, I often thought, well, this is a particularly dramatic case. The abjection is extreme, sort of everything about the situation is extreme, and how far can we really generalize this to other forms of humanitarian work? And then when Rehane's question sort of reminded me of that, because there is a term in Hindi, this would be called seva, it's service. And the sort of classic example from Bengal is my Guru Behan, Sarah Caldwell, who wrote the sort of classic study of aging. So the idea is that when you take, and this is very much what people say, taking care of your parents is a duty. To do this seva, the service of your aged parents, it's highly gendered, and in particular, it's the idea of cleaning up their shitty clothing and bedding, which is kind of central to that. Men would be less likely to do it, women would be more likely, but that's what you do. And so it's the caring professions, you know, how much of the caring professions have to do with, I find, first of all, the gendering is interesting. So she writes about, you know, it's girls who do this for their aged parents, even though the girl has become part of another family, being a wife, so she'll come back to take care of her parents as the seva, as good of her dharma or her duty. Secondly, that inversion, it's the nursing magazines, which I discovered also in my own research. These are the ones, if you want to find out about bodies and contact and personal relation, don't look in the medical journals, and look in the nursing journals, they're full of it. And the medical journals are not. But also although that kind of activity is often sort of the reversing the hierarchy. So in the Sikh langar, you'll often go to eat somewhere, and you have the man who is picking up everyone's plates and washing them may well be some judge or doctor or some sort of prestigious professional. So that idea of gaining status by lowering yourself is very much a part of the Sikh religion, but also other certain Hindu sects, even as it kind of directly contravenes the Brahmanical lifestyle. So in a complicated way, all these tropes are being repeated in forms of seva. My question to you was then, if we say that confrontation with the abject, or at least in a less dramatic way, with just sort of normally bodily dirt, particularly caring for aged parents or aged people, that this is an aspect of the caring professions that simply isn't talked about too much. You found a few articles in the nursing magazines. It's been central to your dissertation, but are there intellectual or social or institutional reasons why this dimension of it is kind of repressed in the public discussion?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, of course, it's obvious that it's the generalization of it to the humanitarian work as such is somewhat counterintuitive, maybe, right? It's like very much against the dominating discourse, and especially the most popular charity now, as it is promoted. Especially if you look at any booklet of the humanitarians, and especially if you take the most successful ones, getting the most funding from the Silicon Valley, it's very much the utilitarian-based calculation of the most effective way to save more life, convert this into that, convert education into happiness, and so on and so forth. So this goes much, of course, against it, but the thing is, if one looks, of course, into the experience, what they do there themselves, the humanitarian workers, as in the books of Peter Redfield and many others. that is just a thing you gotta look at, because what they write a lot about, and that's what I saw myself in the field as well, that there is, people are not feeling that way which they represent. They're not feeling that they're doing this rationally organized, clear work, right? But this thing about the experience of some not that clear experience of being there and being with the people and caring for them in this ambivalent way, it is the key element of that. The experience which is hard to disentangle, right? And for me, this turning to the unpleasant, kind of dark, repressed side of it is the way to address this unclear, entangled core in the humanitarian experience. But why is it repressed? Of course, it is a clear, I think, quite clear answer to that. Well, not a sufficient, but one clear answer is that it is because of the general official discourses of modernity, demoralize, especially ones. They tend to be quite puristic, and there is, for instance, very good book by Alexis Shotwell about that, about the political thought in general and the imaginations of the world, how it should be. It's very, very much puristic and very much has to resort to rational explanations. The irrational, especially in the due to the secularization and cutting off of all the transcendental meanings of the work, all the justification for the moral mission of doing something has to be found in some rational explanations, that this is an objective good and this is exactly how we are rationally kind of going to reach it, right? But the thing is that it's obvious that humanitarianism, the obvious problems of humanitarianism, that it has been never able to fix the world, and it never would probably. And there's plenty of critics of it, of creating these problems and that problems at the same time as saving this or solving this to an extent, never completely. And so my answer to that is, instead of trying to fix humanitarianism and try to make the true humanitarianism plan which will solve the problems and fix the world, for me the answer is you gotta look what it actually consists of instead of what you imagine it to be about.
The question that also was partly answered and was also addressed somehow in a lot of previous questions, but I would just like to ask that a bit more explicitly. What was the perception of the patients, if I may call them?
Residents there usually, but
residents of the volunteers. So I mean, how, because I mean, we heard a lot about it, but what was your, like, I mean, of course, that's a very broad question, but I would just be curious how they perceived them, how they framed them over a long time. Were they crazy? Were they beneficial? Were they, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do my research particularly on their perceptions. Didn't go into that deep, but I think it was a mixture of all of those. Clearly, there is like a big division between the white saviors, kind of the empowered, privileged people, and those who are vulnerable. And there is, of course, the standard hierarchical relation of sorts, that these are people with whom we gotta be respectful and because they come to help us. But also there's obviously, you could see it more on the side of the workers, the local workers, that there is quite some lack of respect, you say, like thinking that they are of course somewhat privileged and not aware enough of the context and of the realities that they
resentment.
not that real. Yeah, resentment or yeah. So the resentment was, there was one interesting case with the resentment, which I also described in this little post, during the COVID, when this hierarchy got inverted, because obviously there is quite some resentment for the privileged foreigners coming and distributing aid there, which became apparent at a street clinic. There was like a Canadian NGO coming and establishing a street clinic, where they would clean wounds as well, like give some medicines, do some simple medical work. And it was already after the beginning of the COVID-19 in China, but before it came to India really. But there was already expectation that it would come. And the volunteers would wear masks. And, but even I think they were, I'm not sure whether they were wearing masks already because of the COVID or not, but anyway, I think yes, already it was probably part of their concerns. But anyway, one of the locals started shouting at them, apparently somewhat tipsy local man on the street, that he started shouting in Bengali, and then one of the local co-workers translated said that he was shouting that it's you who are the virus, not us.
I have a question because we have still a couple of minutes and I want to ask a question too. And it's about the relation between your theory, which is quite vague, right? From Kristeva and Bataille and the transgressive character of filth and so forth, and the ethnography. I mean, I find the theoretical explanation inherently consistent also with the critique of modernity. I just wonder to which extent that would cover or resonate with the experiences of somebody who says, well, suddenly I saw this is also a person in the body of Christ. So which role does filth here play? I would spontaneously say, well, perhaps it's simply looking through all that filth and realizing it's a human being just like me. So what do you think? Did you discuss that ever?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I made emphasis here more on theory to make it into a coherent description of what I did there, right? Less on the ethnographic parts, which I could quote as well. But of course, yeah, there is somewhat a problem with getting the direct description of experiences of filth from the volunteers. And I think also there's still a lot of space to really find out how it works, to see the mechanism of it through ethnographic means. And the complication is that, of course, filth and dirt are such things about which we don't have discursive means to talk, because exactly these are things which are outside of the meaningful experience by definition. So people do not have tools to talk about that as a meaningful experience that much. At the same time, there's a lot of people talking about filth. Not like one of the things that they just don't talk about filth, they just talk about Kolkata, such all this. They oftentimes they don't mention it, but they don't describe it, but they mention it as a reality which is there, which everyone is aware, right? And they mention the hardships of encountering this and that. Marie, for instance, whom I quoted here, she a lot wrote me, she gave me in an interview, spoke a lot about the disgust towards this objection of the people in their daily life, not the matters as such, but this poverty, how they're treated, how they have to live their life, this lack of love, what she calls, and so on. She writes a lot about that as a kind of this repulsive matter which she has to overcome. Then, as I said, there's a lot to trace the connection with ethnography. There is a lot to decode, but I think there is a clear combination of the experience of loss and repulsion, which many of them describe. Then description of the techniques to deal with it, to control it, and then all of descriptions of the value of the connection which they get from this kind of different sort of connection which they obtain by controlling their repulsion. Once again, yeah, the mechanisms we can assume, and maybe through some other ethnographic details can trace them better, but I think this already suggests some chain of experiences which is repeated through different volunteer stories, which can be described in a particular pattern.
Suddenly more questions. Here we go. Yeah, there is one.
Yes. Thank you, Igor, for the wonderful presentation. This is also personally very interesting for me because I am from Kolkata, and I have also been here only once when I was very young, but it brings back so many memories. I have a very brief question for you. I wanted to ask about what the quality of medical care was during your stay. I mean, what did you see and what did you think about it? Because there have been, since I was growing up, I have been reading a lot of literature on one part about Mother Teresa as being this saint, and also that is also how the government portrays her, the West Bengal government in this particular case. And on the other hand, there are also scientific journals and journals writing about the more spiritual approach to healing that is taken by the neo-Maldives home, as opposed to perhaps scientific medical approaches. So could you maybe comment on that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's a good approach to kind of understand what the missionaries of charity are doing there, because the quality of medical care there was fragmented, let's say. They send a lot of people to the hospitals. They have their particular hospitals. The Hope is one clinic which was working with them. They were sending some residents for surgeries as well. But there is a very illustrative story of one Belgian doctor who, on his first day, he got a person brought into he was working there as a doctor while he was volunteering. A person brought there with a severe, I think, kidney failure, and he saw that this person is possible to save if we urgently send him for the surgery, but the sisters didn't send him. And when he started kind of asking, they just disappeared. And then one of them came to him and said, like, this is how it happens here. Some people die and they die, some people don't, because that is the order of things here. And of course, if he then accepted it and he got used to it, because that's how it works there. Also, a lot of volunteers told me that the most hellish places they saw in Kolkata were the public hospitals. When they had to bring somewhere there, not even to mention that these homeless people were not admitted to the public hospitals, but even if they were, there were places not of Western kind of medical standard, right? So it doesn't apply much. But the main thing is that Mother Teresa herself and the sisters, they say we're not doing medical job here. And they always say, if someone replaces us with some things which would be socially better accepted, official centralized education, official centralized hospitals, not necessarily that they think that this is better than what they're doing, but if people want something different and services not needed, we'll go somewhere else. There will be some place for us to do, but we are not medical institution consciously. And of course, there are like a lot of articles in Lancet and others who are writing about how they're not medical, but yes, they're not medical. That's what they are. Right?
Okay, we have Nina here.
Thank you very much. I also have a question that's more out of curiosity than out of understanding the theory, and that is, what was your experience as a field worker like at the hospice? I saw the ethnography was very much experience-based, and I was wondering whether your positionality there differed from the other volunteers, because you were a volunteer, but you were probably also conducting interviews and you were drawing people. So did that sort of spark the curiosity of the residents and of the other volunteers? And also, did you yourself undergo a transformative experience? Did you subscribe to what the other volunteers told you in your interviews? And also, is there an experience that you can sort of liken to this experience that was set in the context of a fully institutionalized healthcare system, market logic oriented? Have you ever worked in a hospital that is sort of more like what we have here in Germany? And does that experience differ from the experience that you had there?
Thank you. And good questions. Okay, I'll go briefly. No, I haven't worked, but I know our medical system more from the other side, right? And from the readings of the critiques of the medical, clinical logic and all of that, which are kind of abundant. And it also goes to the critique of Mother Teresa and the medical institution. There are so many critiques of medical institutions as medical institutions that demanding from her to be a medical institution somehow seems incoherent. But anyway, my own position, I had to write about it in the dissertation because I had to rely a lot on the intersubjective imagination, right? To reconstruct the experiences of the volunteers from my own imagination. And it relied a lot on my own experiences. But I was there first time not as a researcher, but just as a backpacker and volunteer myself. And that was basically probably my better point of reference, because of course when I came as a researcher, I was more in an observation mode, which was a very different experience. You could not rely on that much. And my transformation, yes, after my first time actually, it was not like the transformation point, but it played a big role, I think, in my conversion to Catholicism actually. I was a Christian, but I was baptized in the Orthodox Church, as most people in Russia, but then I converted because of that to a large extent, and started practicing going into religion more than before. And the sketches, yes, the sketches were really interesting too, at some points especially, because when I had time to sit down and draw someone, it really establishes different connections. And when the person sees themselves through your eyes, as a guest, it's something different. And also in the shelter, taking pictures, taking photographs was prohibited because of all this poverty porn and all kind of the touristic, because a lot of volunteers would just come as tourists for a couple of days to see something and photograph something. And the sisters do not want that, and so that was a good way around.
The last question, please.
I had two questions, and then I think he somewhat asks one more question. So, also mostly out of curiosity, and I was kind of inspired by your replying or comment. I was wondering, in your observation, did you see any difference of attitude or difference of behavior in the volunteers in terms of gender difference? For example, like how the woman would respond to especially, I think maybe you quoted perhaps one from Hong Kong. Is that a male, or because the others? Because the others seem by the name were like female. So I was wondering if there is a difference that you've observed. And the second question, even though he somehow asked, but then I still have one more question. So the first time when you were there as a backpacker, and so not as a researcher, but as an actual volunteer, I was wondering how you coped with this repulsion that you might have, if any. And also when you mentioned about seeking liminality, I was also wondering if you personally relate to that, or that is more like an academic observation for you.
Liminality which the volunteers undergo.
Yes.
Yeah. So for the first one was
the gender difference.
The gender, yeah. The gender, I observed mostly the work of men because the shelter, for instance, this one was divided into male and female halves. A lot of actually females would come, the volunteers, to work on the male side as well, especially in the dressing room, but not the other way around. So some part of it I'm missing completely, but in general I wouldn't say that there is a big difference. There is a bit more women than men volunteering, but I wouldn't notice like a strict difference in the approach to what they're doing. The other one, my own techniques, of overcoming it. I think I didn't have, like back then, I didn't use much the religious narratives which are offered by the sisters. Like one of them was, of course, one of the most common, you just hold back your senses kind of for a while when it's really hard and try not to react to anything. Another one is to look closer into it, to look closer into the things which you are disgusted with, which you don't want to look at, and then if you look at them more, for instance, then it releases somehow, becomes easier, and you start to perceive it as also, I would say, a bit like your own wound, or like somehow this object-subject distance breaks, but it's another large topic would be. And the last one was about
the seeking liminality.
Yeah, the liminality. I experienced it myself pretty much. The Kolkata experience itself is like a place which is otherworldly quite a lot. And when I recall my first visit to the Kaligat home, for instance, I recall that my perception, my imagination of the place was completely different from how the place actually looks. When I tried to recall what I did in that time, I actually could not place it geographically in which room I was doing what, because it was really otherworldly back then, and the transformatory period also applied to me in that time when I was traveling there and doing time, so it was also the rite of passage to an extent, more liminoid probably than liminal, but still.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, the very last question.
Okay, briefly, can
I know your research didn't necessarily focus on this, but I'm just kind of curious to ask how the residents frame this experience for themselves.
The residents?
The methods that the volunteers would choose to feel the experience. For example, we were talking about how they would merge the body of the resident with the body of Christ. How would the residents see that in a way as though they themselves are sanctified, or rather that they're being used as a religious vessel?
No, yeah, as I said, I didn't particularly research the residents that much, but of course I touched with that as well. But I would not say that it's that they saw themselves as being used for that, at least not systematically, because for them it's also obviously a liminal experience. They are people who are, there could be problems for some of them with their religion, because they had to, their hair was shaved and they had to abandon their things and all of that, and they could not follow the prescriptions of their religion oftentimes. But for them it also was accepted as a part of the being on the verge of death. It's basically they were in this, it's like a limbo, where they were by necessity of being in a different state of existence, you can say. And in the state of existence, for many of them, you could see these connections with the people around them who were taking care of them. They were really valued in a way. They were important also for the residents, surprises and also. You can imagine, they brought from the street, shaved and put in this place where some Western people will come and like bring them food and feed them and all of that. It's a very particular experience for them, for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was great.